As Josh said, my name is Matt Croasmun. I'm the staff pastor here at the church. I just came off a season of sabbatical last fall, and one of the new things that's meant I've had in my life is playing soccer twice on the weekends. I play Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings. Yes, in the snow, we shovel or just play in the snow or sneak onto fields that have been cleared by plows. Anyway, it's been interesting. It's been a great kind of like revival in my life. I love playing soccer, meeting all kinds of great people. More about that maybe some other time. But the one interesting thing to put in my life is I drive on Saturday mornings now, which means, as I do when I'm in the car, I don't drive much, but when I am in the car, I listen to sports radio. I tend to listen to ESPN radio when it's just on in the car. And the other day, for a couple Saturdays now, at this like random time that I tend to be coming back from soccer, I hear a recurring, amazing, unbelievable, like crazy, I thought I was on the wrong station kind of segment on ESPN. It's so crazy I can't actually explain it to you. So I'm just gonna have you listen to it. You just have to hear a little bit of this from ESPN Radio.
Mel Kiper Jr. is an ESPN NFL draft analyst. His life revolves around NFL draft prospects.
You have 5 teams in the top 8 desperately needing quarterbacks. Love this physicality. I think goes in the top 5 overall.
But there's one thing Mel enjoys more than the NFL draft. It's The Bachelor.
That's number 1.
Now it's time for Mel's Bachelor Big Board.
Get back to Rose, even. I'm going home.
With Dari and Mel on ESPN Radio. Number 1.
Yeah. And this has been for 2 weeks trying to figure this out. I'm going to go with Jade. Jade comes in at number 1, 28 years of age, 2 tattoos out of LA, California. Jade, Becca goes back and forth, Nikki, but I'll go Jade 1, Becca 2, Nikki 3.
I kid you not. I'm not making this up. I can't make that up, right? Like, you heard it for yourself. This actually happens. It's been happening weekly on ESPN Radio on Saturday mornings. It's been Mel Kiper's Big Board update. I guess from a few weeks back, as I gather now, because I know from Mel Kiper that The Bachelor's over, I think. And he would rank each of these women week by week. I think this is pulled from his preseason rankings, as it were, who he thought kind of looked to be the kind of head of the pack at the beginning. Anyway, it's insane, right? Absolutely crazy. And it is. There's nothing I'm going to say that's not going to make that less crazy than it is. But I want to say, well, I think it's an absolutely insane way to think about love, to like be ranking, based on the number of tattoos. Anyway, the crazy way to be thinking about love, I think it's also, in a certain sense, I'm going to try to convince you, I don't think it's so uncommon, actually. Actually, when it comes to love, which we've been talking a fair bit about during the season of Lent, when it comes to love, we tend to think that first you try to figure out whether or not someone or something is worth loving, and then you go ahead and love them. Even more so, since we know that love requires commitment, and commitment carries with it all kinds of costs and opportunity costs. I'm freaked out by commitment. We take it that the first choice of whom to love is of singular importance. Everything we take, it hinges on choosing the right object, the lovely object. And so The Bachelor or The Bachelorette, I can't believe it's now franchised, is the perfect picture of this, right? Since the first task is to find the perfect object of our love, you actually have to start. It makes sense. You better start with 20 or 30 kind of possible options. The more options, the better chance you'll find the one. On some accounts, the only one with whom true love might be possible. The one who is truly lovely, who's truly worth loving. The only one to whom it makes sense to commit. Love them or hate them, I take it that The Bachelor, these kinds of shows, I think actually carry to a logical extreme a generally accepted intuition that probably many of us share about how love and commitment work. Namely, that when it comes to love, the scarce commodity is finding someone worth loving. Finding that someone who is worthy of your love. That's the hard part. And that's actually why ESPN's parody is so kind of spot on and why it works. This is sport. Our nation's true kind of favorite pastime here is relational vetting. ESPN is right. This is prospect evaluation. And we can snicker at the metrics and at what counts in this evaluation, numbers of tattoos, whether you're from a suitably sunny locale. We may think that we are better scouts, better talent evaluators. But the fact that we think that actually shows that we've nevertheless bought into the same general process of vetting, of evaluating, of finding the right person, the rare object that is actually worth loving. But then, so the thinking goes, if you really get that step right, if you truly find the object worthy of love, then everything else is easy from then on. Love, commitment, life together. Sure, there will be ups and downs, but the assumption is that if you picked the object of your love correctly, if you made the right consumer choice, all the rest will be easy. This is why at the end of the season, after all the vetting is done, and only after all the vetting is done, there is a ring. Only then does commitment enter into the picture, a step ventured only on the assumption that the vetting process has made commitment itself more or less unnecessary. The ring signifies not commitment, but confidence in the wisdom of unbridled consumer choice.
Wow.
I think actually, The Bachelor, exposes this for us in some pretty kind of naked ways, pun would be intended a bit, but I think it's actually kind of something that we share. Today I want to ask, what if it's actually the other way around? What if the only way to see just how lovely someone is to commit to them first? What if committed love is the context in which we actually become most lovely? What if that's actually what love is for? First we love, and in the process of walking out that love, we actually make one another more lovely. More or less, that's what I want to argue this afternoon. And if that is true, if love works best, if you decide to love before deciding that someone or something is lovely, if that's true of romantic relationships, of friendships, of churches, of communities, even of cities, then if we really want to learn to love, we really have to embrace commitment. It all comes down to commitment, that cost of love we're perhaps least willing to pay. After all, that's what a show like The Bachelor is. It's a huge machine to protect the man, or frankly also the women, from having to pay the cost of commitment unnecessarily. A huge machine that merely reflects the gargantuan vetting processes and machinery that we've constructed in our own lives that serve a similar function to protect us from the cost of commitment that we so desperately want to avoid. So today, that's what I want to talk about. A costly love that commits. And I want to talk about why, against every intuition that we've been given by our culture, commitment is actually a cost that we should be glad to pay. Because it's what makes love work. It's what makes love do what only love can do. Refine us, transform us, make us lovely. And so as we begin that, why don't we should pray, ask God to be here with us. So, the Holy Spirit, we ask that you would be here in this place. Lord, we want to learn to love like you do. We want to dare to love like you do. So would you come and have your way in this place? Would you bring to mind the particular relationships, the particular communities, particular venues for love that you want to speak to us about this afternoon? Come and have your way in us. Amen. So the central text I want to look at this afternoon is perhaps an odd one. I'll explain a bit where it fits into the story of the Bible and kind of what's going on. But really, this text has become meaningful to me, and meaningful to me in thinking about commitment in particular, because two friends of mine asked me to preach on this text at their wedding. They just sent me the kind of verse reference. That's odd. I can't even tell you what that says, so let me go look it up, and this is what I found. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. It's a kind of intense passage, right? Where you die, I will die, there I will be buried. Not even death will separate you and me. I mean, this is intense even for a wedding. In fact, I wondered, it was a bit morbid. I don't know, guys, is this really what you want? It's so the opposite of the way that we tend to think about love and commitment. It's a declaration so audacious that I admit I wondered whether even a wedding ceremony was an appropriate place to champion so desperate a confession of commitment. But then, of course, comes the kicker. This isn't a marriage vow. The relationship involved in the passage isn't a romantic one. This is a declaration of friendship, a commitment of love from one widow to another. And then it hit me. This love isn't too radical for a wedding. It's not too radical for the rest of life. In fact, this audacious picture of love ought to challenge every lukewarm love we practice in every aspect of our lives. This audacious commitment is actually a model, I think, for our relationships with our spouses, yes, but also our friends, our families, our communities, our churches, our cities. There's an invitation here to embrace the cost of commitment rather than protect ourselves from it. And in that cost, find the sort of connection, the sort of love that we've always wanted. So the situation, just to know a little bit about what's going on in the passage. The situation in the passage is this. There's two women, well, it's three in the picture. Naomi is this Moabite widow of a Judean man, and she's living in Moab. So she married an expat in her area of the world, and she's there. And Ruth and Orpah are these two widowed daughters-in-law. They're the wives of Naomi's sons, who themselves have died. So to say these are these three widows, right? Two generations of widows. To say these women are exposed or in danger would be an extreme understatement. But then Naomi, as if to make herself yet more vulnerable, chooses to leave the land of her birth in Moab and go to Judah, the land of her late husband, because she hears that God has turned around the fortunes of the people that had led her husband to immigrate to Moab to begin with. So she sets out, a woman without a country, without a people, seeking to be a part of the people of God. And so the question immediately arises, what should her daughters-in-law do? Should they follow? Should they stay? Certainly the most strategic thing they ought to do is stay. They're young, they have nothing to do with Judah, save for their half-Jewish late husbands. And Naomi insists she's not lovely, not worth loving. There's no strategic advantage she can offer them, no way that she can help in their predicament. Ruth's love would be more strategically invested elsewhere. And yet Ruth takes the plunge. She commits. So audaciously, so recklessly even. She says to Naomi, after Naomi has encouraged her to think practically about this decision. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay." And perhaps there's some spark of God in Naomi that Ruth sees, or perhaps that it's simply that Naomi is there. Naomi is all she has left. Ruth is all Naomi has left. And so Ruth makes the call to commit first. And whatever the reason, and perhaps part of the challenge here is for us to give up there needing to be a reason, Ruth commits to Naomi. The result, the final verse of this short book tells us, is that a way is made for the people of God. Ruth finds a husband in Judah and gives birth to a son who is the grandfather of King David, who we heard a bit about last week. Ultimately, through David, Ruth is the grandmother of Jesus, the man who realizes all the hopes and dreams of the people of God. Through this woman, the plans of God are advanced, all because Ruth commits to Naomi audaciously, completely. Some might say prematurely. And in so doing, I think she paves a way for us to escape the ugly consequences of our relating to love as essentially a high-stakes consumer choice. I'm sure there are more than two of these dynamics, but I just want to focus in on two kind of dynamics of this kind of consumer model of love that committing actually saves us from. Committing first allows us to cut off the never-ending cycle of vetting. And actually lets us deal constructively with brokenness. Brokenness in our lives, the brokenness in somebody else's life. So first, the trap of the never-ending vetting process. In a certain sense, what I'm trying to talk about here, I guess, is just kind of a matter of relational FOMO. I don't know. I've learned this term. I think economists have long called this opportunity cost, but FOMO is hipper. I think that this happens in our friendships. We're hesitant to commit because we're afraid of missing out on something or someone better. And so even though we say that we're just trying to be wise about our relational commitments, in practice, we actually never commit. Results are disastrous. We can end up in marriages where this vetting process actually never ends. A vetting process that's maybe appropriate in a certain sense for a dating stage continues to frame the marriage itself. And we never stop evaluating our spouse. We compare them. We keep our eye out for better options. Similarly, we can never actually invest in a community. We can never actually commit to a church. We can never fully send down roots in a place or in a city because we're constantly evaluating, constantly questioning whether any community could be worth our commitment. And we're still left thinking that this if we're still left thinking that this commit first plan is dangerous or crazy, all we really need to do is consider whether anyone looking for the perfect object of affection, the mythical, worthy object of love, would ever choose to love us. I can't speak about you, so I'll just speak for me. I am incredibly blessed that my wife, my daughter, my family, my community, and my church have chosen to love me in spite of my unloveliness. It's the only way I'm ever going to find anyone to love me. And this is perhaps the most important reason to dare to commit first. If you're on the vet, then commit plan, brokenness, or sin, as the Bible talks about it, is evidence that committing isn't worth it, or maybe even worse, that committing was a mistake. In a vet, then commit marriage, my spouse's brokenness is a sign that I married the wrong person. In a vet, then commit friendship, my friend's sin is a sign that I chose the wrong friend. In a vet, then commit family, my parents' sin is a reason to cut myself off from relationship. In each case, as the consumer I understand myself to be, I experience buyer's remorse. I should have read more and more accurate reviews. And we consider ourselves absolved of our commitment since we made it, after all, we think, under false pretenses. Namely, we thought that we had found a perfectly lovely object. Not only does this end up meaning we actually never commit, but it also provides every motivation to hide our own brokenness, because we know, or at least fear, that those around us will see our brokenness in the same way, as evidence that they made the wrong bet on committing to us in love. So as we enter into relationships, we kind of present ourselves as though we were on the showroom floor, and then we hide our true selves as long as possible, lest we be returned to the store for exchange. The problem, of course, is that sin loves to grow in the dark. As Jim described last week, sin grows, it multiplies when we bury it, when we refuse to pay the cost of transparency. And so this fear of being discarded actually fuels the very brokenness that drives us to hide, and the cycle repeats itself, and we become more and more convinced that we are more and more unlovely until we are absolutely determined to hide our truest selves, lest the last few people left confused enough to love us find out the truth. But if you're on the commit first plan, brokenness is something quite different. Brokenness is actually an invitation to live out that commitment to love by speaking the truth. Speaking the truth in service of transformation and in service of reconciliation of the relationship. And make sure you hear that correctly, because on the commit first plan, brokenness is an invitation to participate in transformation. It doesn't mean condoning the brokenness of the other person. It doesn't mean getting a pass on your own brokenness. But it does mean that brokenness isn't a sign that the relationship was entered into under false pretenses. In fact, exposing and addressing brokenness on this model is precisely the function of love. It's what it's fine-tuned to do. So my friend's sin is no reason for me to bail. My church's sin is no reason for me to bail. And as a result, I'm actually free to live with remarkable transparency. I have no reason to hide my sin. It's not going to cost me anything relationally. And sin hates the light. And so the simple fact of actually living in transparency, which is possible in this context of committed love, actually begins to undo the brokenness in our lives because it invites that brokenness out into the open. That means that commit first love is messy. It means that sometimes love will look like Nathan's frankness in naming David's sin and convicting him of sin that we heard about last week. But in a commit-first relationship, the naming of sin isn't a step toward breaking relationship. Rather, it's a part of living out a commitment to love, calling one another out, inviting one another into God's freedom, never to condemn, never to ultimately completely end relationship, but rather to convict. This is messier love. It's more audacious love than the Bachelor ever imagines. More audacious love than a consumer choice model would ever produce. And while I've been focusing for a while now more or less on interpersonal relationships, I take it that this also applies to our choices to commit to communities as well. Similar dynamics are at work. We can end up in an unending process of evaluation and vetting that keeps us on the outside as we wait, perhaps forever, to find the perfect church, the perfect community, or even the perfect city worth really investing in. As a result, this social level dynamic further feeds our individual instinct to hide our stuff, right? And to pretend that we and the communities that that become important to our identity are flawless and therefore worthy to be loved. Something that, like this dynamic, I take it is at work in all sorts of kind of social level denial. As participants in racist, sexist, and otherwise unjust communities, we're incentivized to pretend that these communities are nevertheless as impossibly lovely as we ourselves feel required to pretend to be. Instead, God invites us to experience the freedom of being commit-first community members. People who commit to love transformatively, boldly, dangerously the communities into which they are placed. Like Ruth, we may be surprised at the scale of the fruit of this sort of posture toward community. I think of this often when I think about how I ended up in the church that I ended up attending during college. I had spent much of my freshman year in that never-ending vetting process, visiting churches, deciding that they weren't for me or I wasn't for them. And it wasn't until the beginning of my sophomore year that God kind of graciously relieved me of my burden of choice in this really beautiful way. It began when God convicted me that one way or another I needed a church home, not just a campus fellowship. I needed an intergenerational church community. And so I returned to campus my sophomore year, committed to making that happen. And to make sure it happened, I used it as a commitment device. I decided I was going to spearhead my campus fellowships, kind of like get students to go to church efforts. I was patient zero, so I might as well be a part of the solution as well. And so mostly that looked like just kind of curating a list of local churches and a list of student contacts for these various churches. which was great because it conveniently left me with a veritable Bachelor-esque slate of possible matches. I could rank them, right? The twist came on the first Sunday morning on campus that fall. Through a couple of circumstances I won't go into, I ended up, when I finally made my decision to go to church, I was too late to go to just about any of the churches on my list. There was just one that I could still make it to. It was the New Haven Vineyard Church, at that time meeting out in Hamden. And so I sprinted down to Phelps Gate where there were rides leaving from the church, and I hopped into, I believe it was Bob's car. Hi, Bob. And that's Bob. He took me to the Vineyard the first Sunday. And I hopped in the back of this guy's car. I had no idea who he was, and I was off to church. And suffice it to say, the Vineyard was not the church I was looking for. Would not have made the preseason top 10. And my experience there, there were intriguing things. After worship, the drummer got up and started preaching. So that was kind of awesome. The drummer was preaching. Only later did I figure out the preacher had to play the drums. But either way, that was kind of intriguing. But there were also lots of things that just weren't my style. People raised their hands in worship. My Midwestern background was a no-go. They danced, they occasionally shouted, or even cried. Worst of all, they cried. That made me feel most uncomfortable. Worse yet, the drummer pastor preached about the Holy Spirit, which at that point in my life, I basically thought was kind of like the book of Revelation. It's there's something you need to believe in, but if you kind of get too focused there, you're going to get weird. And he just kept doing it, right? He just kept preaching on the Holy Spirit. And all to say, the New Haven Vineyard wouldn't be getting a rose, much less the ring, right? Until that is, I got back to campus, and I noticed that my directory, which I needed to complete for the activities bazaar that was happening in 20 minutes, had a blank spot next to student contact for the LCD, or for the New Haven Vineyard. And I thought, well, I'm a completist, and so I wanted to have it done, and I thought no one was going to give me a call anyway, so I put down my name. I mean, what the heck? I at least knew where to get the rides at Phelps Gate. To my astonishment, for the next 6 to 8 weeks, I got calls every week from multiple students who wanted to go to the Vineyard. And so week after week, I had to go. And that was the student contact. And the teaching continued not to be to my liking. More stuff about the living presence of God, about supernatural healing, about hearing God's voice and casting out dark spiritual forces from people. And people continued to raise their hands and jump around and cry and do all sorts of things in worship. It was clear that I was right. Actually, if I hung around these people too long, they were going to make me weird. but I had to keep going. I just kept getting calls. And that lack of choice was actually exactly what I needed. God began a renewing work in my life, which I never would have submitted to had it been up to me. And 16 years later, here I am, having spent a decade on staff of Vineyard churches, having planted a Vineyard church, now loving this local community and our larger community of churches in ways that I never could have imagined. And that's meant allowing my brokenness to be exposed in this community and in this community of churches. That's meant naming brokenness when I've seen it in the broader community, the broader Vineyard community of faith. But committing first made all the difference. I'd never have known how lovely the Vineyard was or how lovely the people are. Or how lovely it is to give up control and become a bit weird when the call of God requires it. So let me ask you, is God perhaps inviting you to commit first to a broken church? To a church like this one, full of broken people, desperately in need of God's healing work, occasionally less aware of that need than we ought to be. But might God not be calling you to commit first, and then, in the context of that commitment, find what is lovely about life together with God? Or can you commit first to the ungentrified, unlovely city? To the harsh city, to the lonely city, even to the violent city. Not to condone its violence, but because only in committing to it first in love is there hope that its violence and your violence will be transformed into peace. Perhaps it occurs to me even knowing God may work this way. Not that God has flaws we need to learn to look past, but perhaps there is a vetting of God that keeps us in a perpetual state of evaluation and on the outside of the life of faith. Perhaps that's where you're at this afternoon. Perhaps God, too, is one whose loveliness is revealed most fully in the context of a love relationship, a decision to invest. That seems more or less accurate to my mind and my experience of what it's like to follow Jesus and to come to love God, largely in the context of walking it out. But it requires bringing a seemingly premature end to the vetting process, a leap of faith that looks like committing first. In asking for this sort of love, God, of course, isn't asking for anything that God hasn't ventured first. This is the sort of love that God has for us. This is covenant love, to use an old-fashioned theological word, and a word that expresses this most fundamental picture of God's posture toward us, God's radical commitment to us in love. And indeed, the fullest extent of Ruth's commitment is ultimately revealed in the life, death, and resurrection of her descendant, Jesus. On the cross, Jesus says to us, "Where you have gone, I have gone. Where you die, I will die. Indeed, I am now dying." This is how far my commitment to you will go. This is how far I will go. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. In fact, Jesus says, "My death will bring us together. My death will overcome all that has separated us." Because in it, my radical commitment to you in love is sealed and provides a foundation for our relating and for your flourishing. It conquers every broken promise that would separate us, every flaw that would keep you in hiding, every fear that would drive you from my embrace. This is radically committed love. And talk about committing first. Paul, the ancient church planter, puts it this way. "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." This is covenant love. This, Jesus says, is the new covenant in my blood. A foundation of radically committed love that makes it possible for us to be who we are without fear, without reservation, without image management, but with a hope of transformation. Hope that in the context of this covenant, on the unique playing field that is constituted by this uniquely, intensely committed love, we will experience a sort of transformation that is impossible anywhere else. Because we can take risks here. To dare to become the awesome, glorious beings that God created us to be. This is the love that God has for us. The love that Jesus demonstrated for us. We love because God first loved us. Can we dare to love as God first loved us? In the manner that God loved us? Committed to us, bound God's self to us in love. I think this is the invitation that God has for us this afternoon. To dare to imitate his love. A few reflections for you as we transition to communion and worship team. First, I might ask, what relationship in your life is suffering because you're on the vet and commit plan? And that could be a personal relationship. As I said, it could be a relationship with a community or even our city. Second, what keeps you from committing first? When you think about commitment, what emotions pop up? Does it seem appealing? Does it seem frightening? Does it seem foolish? When you think about commitment, what memories come to mind? Finally, the action step to this week, right, is to commit to God, to a relationship, to a community. The journal for this week will help you process this, but honestly, I suppose part of my intuition this week is that to whom or to what we commit may be less important than we imagine it to be. With this completely 100% important caveat, so long as God is at the center of our commitment. If God is at the center of our commitment as our model and also as our source, our commitment to love will bear fruit even, or perhaps especially, when we choose to love those whom or that which is unlovely. As I said, this is an odd sort of love. I take it that it's a love that Christ invites us to live out, because it's the love that He demonstrated for us. So I'd invite you, if you're a follower of Jesus, or if you'd like to become a follower of Jesus, as the worship team leads us into a time of musical worship, I invite you to come forward and to tear off a piece of the bread, Christ's body broken for you, and to dip it in the cup, His blood shed for you, and we can enter into the new covenant in His blood. The new kind of love and commitment that He has extended to us, and that He invites us to extend to one another. And Jesus, on the night that He was betrayed, when He talked about love, He said, as I have loved you, so also you ought to love one another. Is it reciprocal love? Jesus wasn't saying, as I've loved you, pay it back. As I've loved you, so also you ought to love one another. So Holy Spirit, as we come to the communion table, we ask that you would fill us with your power. You would allow us to become people who can love as you love. That we might love one another in our city,